We intend for this to be an interactive dialogue. We hope to generate some responses from the audience and a two-way conversation, really, with the wonderful panelists that we have here with us today. Toward that end, we invite everyone to move toward the front of the room to make this as a closed circle conversation as we can. And with that note, encouraging everyone to move forward. Just start off in the vein of thinking together out loud, admitting that I have been tempted to change the title since arriving earlier this week, to thinking about how do we, coming from the UN Water Conference, one of the themes coming out was global theory for local implementation. And so how do we do that? How do we advance global theory? What is that global theory? Another title that came to mind from Mark Smith's presentation yesterday, developing a system-based framework for sustainability. What does that mean? How do we do that? And then another recurrent theme from various sessions was the importance of learning while doing, right? We have a critical challenge on our hand. There's no time to go to our ivory tower and figure out solutions. We need to work with stakeholders on the ground to figure out which practices work best depending on local conditions and local constraints. So how do we implement or advance learning while doing? We have a fantastic panel today to share ideas of next action steps towards those ends. Really excited to have Hannah Berger from the Nature Conservancy, given her work with stakeholders and corporate agriculture on the ground. Ellen Bruno, who's been doing some really innovative work looking at how policy, regional policy, if you will, lands on the ground and is implemented and kind of consumed or used at the local municipal level. Nick Brozovic is joining us from the University of Nebraska, who brings a world of experience looking at different projects and thinking about stakeholder concerns in different locations, different project areas. Sumya Balasubramanya will join and give a reaction to some of the ideas and really spark the conversation that we intend to have with all of you. And unfortunately, Rachel McDonald was also going to join us, but is not feeling well this morning. Okay, so to start the conversation, I wanted to take a first stab at framing the discussion for all of us. And beginning with acknowledging the challenge that we've been talking about the past 2 to 3 days. We've heard a lot about irrigation and the impacts on our aquifer systems. We're familiar with the water table drawdowns, the impacts on soil health, the impacts on water scarcity and water quality. We've heard a little bit about water quality in terms of the dead zones in our fisheries. What I haven't heard a lot about, and is equally important, I think, for us to consider, is the impact of how we've altered the hydrologic frameworks, the river frameworks around the world. And there's a really great article by Ellen Wall who argues that, or points out that the hydrologic alterations that we have imposed on the landscape are a key characteristic of the Anthropocene, right? We have lengthened our river systems from hundreds of miles to tens of thousands of miles and increased hydrologic connectivity. And so this really points to the need of thinking both about irrigation and drainage management. And the impacts that these hydrologic alterations are imposing upon the landscape are acute, right? Every day we hear of events in the news. Some of the more recent ones are water levels so low in the Mississippi we can't transport food crops. We just had a dust storm incident in Illinois. We've never recorded a dust storm so early in the spring. That's typically a late summer drawdown or drought condition. And we also have mentioned a little bit the impacts that these altered flow regimes have had on our freshwater fisheries. So just to really think about water management more holistically and the impacts that water management is having on our ecosystem. our global ecosystem. So in framing the discussion, I'm going to share how I'm envisioning the challenge and thinking about tackling this challenge, again, with the intent of inviting a response and feedback and a discussion about how we can all frame the discussion when we're trying to engage partners to ensure that we're all communicating in the same language. So at the broadest level, our goal is to protect and enhance natural waters, to sustain agricultural production, domestic water supply, and environmental flow requirements. The objective, how can we achieve that goal? I'm proposing, or thinking out loud, that if we focus on maximizing near-surface terrestrial water storage, right? We think about shallow groundwater, surface water systems, and deep groundwater systems, and we focus on that near-surface system is where we can really manage and implement practices to enhance climate resiliency, promote restoration, and provide adequate food supplies. At the same time, we want to maximize that terrestrial water storage to ensure that food supply, to ensure that environmental stability, and we want to minimize the withdrawals on the irreplaceable deep groundwater aquifers. Who is the key decision maker? I would argue I would promote or put forward that it's the producers, right? That this is a diffuse non-point challenge, and it's the farmers and the landowners that ultimately have to put the practices on the ground to achieve the targeted outcomes. But it's important to acknowledge that they have a lot of outside influences, if you will. So of course, their trusted advisors are those technical service providers, but there's also the market forces that are driving their decisions on what crops to plant. And there's the government policies that are providing incentives, whether they're for the benefit or not in terms of the goals or the targets that we're thinking about. And so what are the practices that we're thinking about? Well, it's the combination of irrigation, precision irrigation, drainage practices, right? So conservation practices, thinking about infield water control, edge of field water control, and even edge of stream wetland restoration. How those practices interact with field management, including fertilizer application and tillage management, cover crops, et cetera, that usual toolbox of practices that we think about when thinking about agricultural regeneration or soil health. The framework that I put forth for us to all think about is how do we prescribe those practices across the wide range of hydroclimatic conditions and geological conditions around the world globally? And how do those factors, how does the management superimposed upon that landscape setting ultimately influence the soil health benefits and the crop benefits and the watershed conditions that we're all here together thinking about? And so just to wrap up, I hope you see how these pieces are weaving together. And the final thought to share is when we're thinking about learning while doing, what we're really thinking about is adaptive management. And there's been a lot of great work to formalize the adaptive management framework and to think about not only how can we learn while we're doing, putting practices on the ground, but also how can we refine our understanding of what our targets are. Are we focused in on the right objectives from a policy standpoint? And even kind of a third loop or third level of learning and thinking about how we can improve the governance of agricultural policies. So with that, I'm excited to pass the ball and have our panelists share their ideas of how we can tackle these challenges, and then again, follow up with the discussion. And Hannah, I'd like to pass the ball to you first.
All right, can you all see me okay and hear me okay? All right. Well, at least you can hear me. I think that's the important part. I don't have slides, but I do have sort of an overview summary of a framework that I want to propose, building off what Kathy just presented. I like sort of to have the audience think about this more in their mind's eye, because I think it's really important that this looks differently to each of you based on your experiences. So I'm Hannah Berger. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and I work on our corporate engagement team. And the short version of what I do is that I translate the best available science and strategy to help companies change their core business operations in support of conservation and social outcomes that we care about as an organization. I also translate from the company what their business needs are, what kind of data they need to make those transformations, back to our internal expert teams. The long version of that is that I use a complex adaptive systems framework, and I'm going to describe to you what that is. And this really actually gets to the heart of some of Kathy's comments, especially her complex systems framework slide, because we need water management to be hyper-local, because conservation is at its heart a local endeavor that's incredibly sensitive on local conditions. But at the same time, we need a coherent global strategy to understand where we are, where we need to go, and how we're making progress. And this is really sort of a conundrum, right? Like, how can we be hyper-local, but then also general enough to be global in nature? And there's no easy solution, so I'm not proposing a solution, but I am proposing a way to think about and organize this complexity that can help bring diverse voices to the table and uncover more effective paths forward. So complex adaptive systems have three major components. And I'm going to give some examples after this, so if some of this goes over your head, it's okay. We're going to build this out a little bit slowly. So the first key feature of a complex adaptive system is emergence. And what this means is there are dynamics, efficiencies, abilities to absorb disturbance that emerge from the interaction of multiple components in a system and aren't necessarily describable or predictable by looking at those components in isolation. So it's really the interaction between those components that give rise to these features that we care about. The second is recurrence, and what this means is that dynamics or actions in one part of a system can have feedbacks or knock-on effects throughout the system. And these knock-on effects can be stabilizing, so a system increases in one area and that creates a decrease in the other. That decrease creates an increase and back and forth, and so you sort of have the stabilizing effect. You can also have a positive feedback loop, or sort of these knock-on amplifying effects where something happens in one part of a system and it amplifies and increases feedbacks in another. And finally, a key feature of complex adaptive systems is adaptation. And this means that systems process information and they adapt and they change in response to external environmental stimuli. And it's easy to think, oh, the system has a mind and it's directional, and that's not what adaptive means in this context. What we mean is the system can process information and increase its ability to persist in the current conditions. So some prototypical complex adaptive systems are quite wise. We have ant colonies, cities, companies, the economy, neural networks, ecosystems, your own interpersonal relationships, the human mind. So when you hear all of those, you think that's a pretty broad categorization. And some would argue that it's broad enough that it's not very useful. And in fact, I would argue that most systems and most interactions, when you look around, are complex adaptive systems, and the kind of problems that we deal with that are not complex adaptive systems are probably actually more edge cases and more narrow. Either way, I think it's important to define this, even though they're everywhere. We're not trying to test a scientific hypothesis, we're just trying to offer a framing, because our human minds are fallible and limited, and we need ways to be able to organize this complexity effectively. I will also just put a plug in that folks in the audience are saying, okay, you've given some features, you've given some examples, you haven't given an actual definition of complex adaptive systems. It's because there really isn't one. So I apologize. You can go online and you can Google it and you can find lots of different answers. I recommend going to the Santa Fe Institute's website. They're probably the leader right now in trying to define this really sort of squishy and ambiguous concept. So I want to now transition and talk to you about why I think about supply chains as complex adaptive systems. And again, I'm on our corporate engagement team at the Nature Conservancy, and so I live, breathe, think supply chains every day. And I really like the complex adaptive systems framework for organizing supply chains. I'm going to sort of take some of the features of supply chains and link it back up to those system features I mentioned earlier. So first, supply chains have emergent properties. So I'll use one emergent property, which is efficiency. If you look at supply chains from the farm all the way to consumer packaged goods on your grocery shelf, looking at those individual components, you might be able to try to predict the efficiency or the cost of how those get from point A to point B. But in fact, all of those system interactions lead to pretty incredible efficiencies. Efficiencies that you wouldn't necessarily predict looking at those component parts. And we even see this in consumer food prices. We pay less for food now really than in any point in human history. And so supply chains have become incredibly efficient. They also have recurrence, and so relatedly, that efficiency is rewarded, right? We have points in the entire system where the more efficient you can get, the less you can, or the more you can make with less inputs, fewer inputs, the better, right? And so those incentives have really entrenched themselves in supply chains. Almost to the point where we see a lot of inflexibility and rigidity with supply chains. We think about trying to manage supply chains for things like transparency, conservation, sustainability. But I would argue that the efficiency drive has been so entrenched that it's really hard to retrofit those other outcomes that we want to see in supply chains. But the good news is that supply chains are adaptive. We've seen some examples of additional external stimuli or pressures on supply chains to be different, and we've seen that work. And so some examples could be organic. Organic still takes up a pretty narrow amount of the supply chain, but you still have seen those pressures really transform 1% of the agricultural landscape fairly quickly here in the Midwest. And 1% might not sound like very much, but for supply chains that, again, are built for efficiency, being able to add an additional incentive in and see that move through the supply chain, I think is pretty phenomenal. So the final sort of plug I want to put in for complex adaptive systems when we're thinking about supply chains, and this is something that Kathy touched on with her opening comments, is that we have lots of different nested hierarchies or nested features in the supply chain. And all of those different levels have different internal drivers, and they have different incentive structures and responses to external stimuli. So what I mean by all that word salad is that when you think about managing supply chains from the global scale or working with companies at their enterprise scale, the drivers, the interventions that are effective are going to be much different than those same incentives and drivers at the farm scale. And you can think about every node of the supply chain having its own specific set of conditions that need to be met for that transformation. So I would agree with Kathy that transformation ultimately does come from the farm scale, but I would push back a little bit, and hopefully Kathy can argue back with me after this. I would also argue that you probably actually need interventions at multiple stages of the supply chain that are complementary. Because it's not just farmers, it's going to have to be an entire supply chain that shifts the way it does business to achieve sort of the conservation and social outcomes that we care about. So given this complexity, how do we proceed in creating or leveraging the supply chain concept to do what Kathy said, which is to come up with a global model that can effectively change conditions at the local scale? And the answer is, I don't think we know. I definitely don't know. But the complex adaptive systems framework tells us that there is complexity, lots of complexity, and where there's complexity, there's opportunities. And when I see folks in a room like this who all come from different places, have different perspectives, different types of expertise, like that is the magic sauce in my mind for thinking about how to navigate that complexity, and instead of feeling overwhelmed by it, using it to our advantage, because there's so many opportunities to carve new pathways through that. And bringing together sort of those collaborative and diverse viewpoints within that complex adaptive systems framework that, again, embraces complexity and acknowledges the complexity and the scale issues really gives me hope and makes me excited. So with that, I'm done with my comments, and I will pass it back to Kathy.
Thanks, Hannah. That was great. And welcome the pushback, because what would be wonderful is to come away from here with all of us thinking together. It is complex and challenging, but what's that first draft, right? Let's get something on the table. And so to that end, I'm really pleased to invite Ellen up to the stage, who can share some insights from some of the work going on in California.
Thank you, Kathy. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Bruno. I'm an extension economist at UC Berkeley, housed in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. Much of my kind of research and extension agenda has been around groundwater management for agriculture in California. And so as Kathy said, I'm gonna use kind of California groundwater regulation and recent changes in that space as an example for thinking about some of these issues we're talking about. And specifically, like, although we're interested in kind of seeking global principles to facilitate local implementation, I think that the ongoing groundwater regulation in California is one particular example of kind of a regional framework that's intended to provoke local implementation. And so I'm trying to approach it as a way we might be able to think about more general principles. So I'm going to be talking about California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The acronym is SGMA, and people call it SIGMA. It passed in 2014, but it has a very long time horizon. And so just as a couple of caveats, this is just one approach. I'm not trying to say it's the ideal approach by any means. In fact, California has lagged behind a lot of other agricultural states that depend on groundwater in getting around to managing the groundwater. But I think it's safe to say that anytime we see kind of collective action over groundwater management, which we know is incredibly difficult to do, it's worth studying and seeing what we can learn from it. But yeah, I will caveat that, this regulation is still very much in its early stages, and so that limits, kind of what we can learn from it today. So prior to SIGMA in California, groundwater has largely been this unregulated, unmeasured resource that's kind of been a free-for-all largely in terms of, if you own a parcel of land, you can pump groundwater, and that has led to declines in the groundwater supply and a host of other unintended kind of consequences. And so the kind of long-standing hypothesis in economics for what would drive a set of agents to come together and collectively manage a resource is just a simple balance between what are the gains from managing that resource, and how does that compare to the costs of kind of bargaining over how to do it? So that's kind of the framework that I'm approaching this and thinking about what California's SIGMA policy is doing in the state. There are lots of things that affect these two sides of the equation. The gains or benefits from managing the groundwater are going to depend on the uses of that groundwater, the value we derive from that groundwater, as well as the local state of conditions, like the degree of current overdraft, how problematic is it at the moment. And these kind of transaction costs or bargaining costs over coming together and figuring out how to do it, like the self-organization of all the agents that depend on the groundwater is going to depend on a number of things, like how many different bargaining parties are there and what are their diverse interests, as well as imperfect and incomplete information over the resource itself and who has information and who doesn't. So lots of different things going on. But before diving into how sort of I think California's SIGMA is altering that equation, let me give you just like some brief background on the policy itself. So SIGMA passed at the end of 2014, and what it did was start by saying local agencies need to come together and create themselves, first of all. We needed to create groundwater agencies, someone to take responsibility for the management of different basins throughout the state. That required a couple of years, so they had to form by 2017. And then following that, these agencies were tasked with coming up with a plan for how to achieve sustainability, and were given another 5 years to come up with their plans. So plans were largely due January of 2021, and then these agencies are given 20 years to actually achieve sustainability. So long timeline, we have yet to see if we have achieved sustainability, but these plans have been submitted to the state of California, and so we can still look into these plans, see what's being proposed, see what's been done so far, and say something about them. This policy covers all major agricultural areas in the state of California, and which accounts for over 95% of the state's groundwater. So it's a very comprehensive policy, but largely doesn't apply to the urban areas that have already fought over their groundwater and figured things out. So through the creation of these local agencies, the SGMA regulation also empowers the local agencies to do a number of management actions. So it gives them new authority, but doesn't tell them how to go about achieving sustainability. So it says things like, okay, these local agencies have the ability to charge pumping fees to generate revenue for basin management activities. It allows them to kind of impose individual pumping restrictions or facilitate trade of those groundwater allocations and that sort of thing. And another important part of it is the state says if the local agency doesn't take care of this themselves, then the state is going to come in and operate as the backstop. And so you have this threat of kind of state control if you don't take it into your own hands, essentially. So just as a quick status update, 114 different plans have been submitted to the state, 11 of which have been already approved, but 39 of them have been deemed either incomplete or inadequate by the state of California, and a remaining 64 are still under review. So very much in progress, but I'm going to give you kind of my analysis of what's in those plans given their kind of conditional status. Perhaps not surprisingly, there's a big focus on supply-side approaches to groundwater management. Of course, if you could get more water, then you don't have to cut back groundwater use, and that's great. But it largely is, in California, we have high winter flood flows, but the main demand is in the summer. And so now it has created a new incentive to capture some of those winter flood flows, store it in the groundwater, do some of this artificial recharge, and then pull it out during the summertime. So this is great. Unfortunately, if you add up all the amount that's claimed across all the different plans, it's more than what's actually available. So that needs to be sorted out. But so there's still going to be an important role for kind of the demand side approaches and kind of finding ways to restrict, limit some of the groundwater pumping or disincentivize the groundwater pumping. And we're seeing in these plans that there is a good deal of demand side management that's being proposed as well. Almost half of the plans include allocations to determine individual pumping limits, with about 2/3 of the plans that are proposing allocations to further propose facilitating trade of those allocations. And prior to SGMA, this is not something that anyone would ever talk about. Essentially, groundwater had no scarcity. You could just pump as much as you want. So there would be no incentive to trade groundwater when there's no scarcity imposed, right? So this is a big change. And about 60% of the plans are proposing an introduction of some taxes or fees of some sort, largely framed as a way to generate revenues, not necessarily as a tool to disincentivize pumping, as economists like to think of taxes, but it is making groundwater more expensive, and it'll still have that kind of side effect. But so what I would argue is that, of course, there's still this long time horizon. We don't know how effective these plans are going to be. It's still a huge change from the status quo, just from what's being proposed. And there's this huge diversity in the approaches across the state of California, suggesting that this kind of decentralized approach is preferred. It's not a one-size-fits-all. The state isn't saying this is how you should approach groundwater management, and the local agencies are coming up with different ways of doing it that kind of fit their local agencies best. So how did this happen? Kind of coming back to this framework I tried to introduce at the beginning about the likelihood of collective action over groundwater management. I think the passing of SGMA and some of the features of the policy changed the bargaining landscape over how to come about and manage groundwater in a couple of ways that are relevant for the emergence of collective action. So first is it reduced, it solved some information barriers. A huge part of the policy was requiring local agencies to develop a detailed water budget and do some hydrologic modeling that was going to be consistent across neighboring basins where there might be hydrologic interconnection, required robust monitoring to track key sustainability indicators, and it required public outreach and engagement as part of the law. And so this information about the state of the resource and the potential unintended consequences of overpumping is being communicated to everyone in the basin. So big changes to information. Second, there was this new role for the state to act as a backstop and kind of altering like the default. You couldn't just come together and say, nah, we're not gonna do anything. And so that reducing the likelihood that the plans are gonna lack teeth. Three, it broadens the power of these local agencies, giving them new authority. It has a governance structure where local agencies are creating boards, and so the board members are agreeing on actions, and that's sort of limiting the number of bargaining parties within the basin. It mandates that a certain set of critically overdrafted basins have to come up with a plan and achieve sustainability, and it sets the timeline to do that, and then it also provides some direct financial and technical support as well. So even though it was mandated for a set of, the majority of these basins we're talking about here, I want to note that there are a handful of basins that submitted plans voluntarily. So even though there was this mandate and state backstop for those, there are clearly other factors going on that have shifted the balance, because some of these basins that were not required to come up with plans and achieve sustainability by 2040 are voluntarily proposing to do so. I'll just conclude with two thoughts. One is that I've really focused here on the local decision-making within the context of SGMA, and not how the state actually came around to passing the policy in the first place, which is obviously hugely important for achieving groundwater sustainability, and I think relevant for thinking about the generalizability of this, that I have less to say about, but I think is really important. But I do think that there is some evidence here, despite it being early stages, that kind of centralized government efforts to reduce kind of some transaction costs regarding bargaining over collective action can drive local groundwater management, and SGMA is an example of that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ellen. And that sets us up well for our last presenter, Nick, who was a part of, contributed to thinking about SGMA and has some insights, some behind the scenes insights, really coming from other project areas or efforts to inform SGMA.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kathy. Let me start by saying a few things. First of all, looking at the picture, some of us have changed more than others. When I look at my young self there, I'm very optimistic. I'm very young, and what I'm thinking is, wow, 2020 is going to be great. I'm going to have a lot of travel. We're going to have a great conference. We're going to have all our friends and colleagues come in from around the world. So there you go. It's a pleasure to have so many of you here, both in the room, in the conference, and virtually. In addition to the Economist/University of Nebraska hat, I'm also Director of Policy at the Dorothy Award for Food Global Institute. So when Kathy asked me to talk about how we might build a global framework that is fully sensitive to local context, and my immediate response is, great, that's the first 5 minutes of my presentation. So what am I going to do after that? So I really want to focus on, and it's a good question, it's a question that comes up and is important and timely. I'm going to talk about 4 things, and they all have T's, so hopefully as we roll into our coffee break, I'm going to talk about time, trust, technology, and testimony. And I'm going to argue that each of these are vital as we think about governance and as we think about globally what we need to provide and what we can learn from the local context. The issue of time and scale is going to go through everything that I say, but I'll start with time. So when we think about groundwater governance, it's really important to have an understanding of what is the baseline that we're working on. When we think about Western water, we really have 19th century water law, we have 20th century infrastructure, and we have 21st century climate variability. And that creates something of a challenge for us to manage that. When we look in the eastern US, we have, and I'm very glad, by the way, that you showed the work of Alan Wall. You know, it's nice to have geomorphologists featured in this kind of setting. I'm a former geologist myself, so I always appreciate that. So in the eastern US, we arguably have 14th century water law, which is the English common law. The infrastructure is from the 17th or 18th century when all the beavers were hunted and you put in millworks. And we have 21st century climate variability. So much of the challenge in the coming years is around how we deal with that, how we adapt those systems. Now, I don't want you to take away from that we just need to modernize, that the answer is modernization. We can go, and I'll come back to this example a little bit later, we can go to the Falaj system in Oman, which I know I've talked with some of you about over the years, where we have 11th century water law. The infrastructure is arguably 17th, 18th century, and we have 21st century climate variability. And those systems can still be quite resilient. So it isn't just a case of new is good. It's a question of understanding how we match the legal and institutional structure to the infrastructure. What are the limits of infrastructure? And in particular, one of the issues of climate variability is that it challenges our conceptualization of what infrastructure is. To me, it's one of the big potentials of nature-based solutions in that it allows us to think about infrastructure not in a built way. So that brings me to my second point, which is trust. Now, I don't think I can actually put it better than Jennifer Schellpepper did yesterday. She did a fantastic job, and essentially what she said is, you can't have good governance without trust. And that's something I've been very fortunate to look at different systems all around the world, some functional, some not so functional. And the thing that all the functional systems have one thing in common, that they are trusted. They're trusted by the people that participate in them and essentially allow themselves to be managed by a common understanding of what the problems and the issues in the system are. Now, there's 2 aspects of that. One is it takes a lot of time to build trust. So very often, one thing that we did a lot more in the past and we're starting to do again, we'll take groups of international visitors to some of our natural resources districts systems. And when you talk to those district managers, the question always comes up, how did you do this? How did you do this? How did you get to this trusted position? And the answer is always, well, you do it, and then you do it for another year, and then you do it for another 40 years. And then you roughly have trust. And certainly the answer from the other side is, well, that's great, but I've got 4 years in my position, so what can I do in that time? And that's a tricky thing. We have to take a long-term view. So again, in terms of Sigma, that's the thing that's it's very good to acknowledge, even if the problems are immediate, you can't solve problems always immediately in water. The other issue with trust is to do with the scale of governance. So we think a lot about how you make somebody okay with changing their behavior. And the thing that I've seen that resonates everywhere is the idea that I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing it for my children and my grandchildren. And that is a thing that I've heard again and again in different parts of the world, right? So I'm willing to change what I'm doing, not for me, but for my grandchildren. And because I know all the people that are going to the high school, I know all the people in town, and that's a mechanism that's really important. It speaks to the time, but it also speaks to the scale of governance. So when we look at functional governance systems, they typically don't manage millions of people. They typically manage, a typical natural resources district is somewhere, even if it's over 1 million acres of irrigated land, it's hundreds, maybe 1,000 growers. So this is something that gives me pause when we go to the global scale, where we're in contexts where two things may be different. One is, when you talk to farmers, their goal may not be for their children and their grandchildren to be on the family farm. In fact, they may be doing whatever possible for that not to be the case. And that creates a governance challenge. And it also creates a governance challenge where relatively small areas have very large numbers of farmers involved. And you have to figure out how to build trust within those groups. The experience of water users associations across the world is very, very variable. But there aren't very large. I mean, the very large water users associations typically have a lot of issues. So that brings me to my third point, which is technology. And I have a couple of points here. First of all, technology is not a substitute for trust. And one of the trends that I see very much as we're moving into an era with big data, with a very fast evolution of agricultural technology, remote sensing technology, is the idea that we can make a shortcut. We know we have to build trust, but we can use a shortcut. We can use technology as a shortcut. And we tend to have magpie syndrome. So we like shiny things. We're attracted to shiny things. And this may be possible. It may be possible, particularly in situations where where the regulator has a lot of enforcement power and where you don't care so much about equity. There are situations globally where you can use technology as a shortcut for trust. But I think it's really important to understand what trade-off that involves. I'm going to go back to the large system in Oman, where in fact, so we talk a lot about water markets. I've been working on water markets for about 20 years. Water markets and tradable permit systems have been in the economic literature for about 50 years. So my academic career spans 40% of water markets. But water markets are recorded over 1,000 years in the Middle East and North Africa. And water markets, I think, are a natural human response to scarcity. So my guess is that the first water market happened very soon after the first canal system, which has put it back 5,000 or 6,000 years. Those systems didn't have, if you're a Sumerian, you're not using a lot of technology to manage your water market. One of the things I love in the systems in Oman is that the largest technical innovation that has come in the last 1,000 years is the pencil. And so they are able to manage those systems and achieve good governance with pencil and paper. Because they have built the trust, they have built the common understanding of the system hydrology and so on. Now, you shouldn't think of me as a Luddite. I also have worked on algorithmic water trading. I love technology. I work a lot with ag tech companies. It's more just understanding where do those roles fit in. When we talk about technology, there's also another key point that I want to make, and that is that when we look at who's making decisions about water, and again, Kathy, I think you put this really well, the growers are making the decisions about water, but you have to look at who influences them. And that is people in the supply chain. In some cases, it's bankers or others that are creating financial opportunities and the capacity to buy equipment. Most of the irrigation infrastructure in the world now is privately owned, privately financed with private decision making. I don't think that's going to change as we move forward in the coming decades. And that means if we're going to have good governance, good practices, we have to have the growers in the room, we have to have the people that influence in the room, and that includes industry. And that's something that does lead to uncomfortable conversations, and that's okay. That's just fine. That's actually desirable. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is testimony. And what do I mean by that? First of all, you have to get the right people in the room. The second piece is, and I've learned this, I have the scar tissue to show this, nobody actually listens to me. It's very hard for me to go to western Nebraska and tell people how they should manage their groundwater based on the analysis that I did. And that's appropriate. It's not my place to do that. But what is very powerful is finding people that have done a good job, those growers and managers that have been innovative and creative, that have built those trusted systems, and get them in the room with other managers and regulators and growers and talking to each other. And so that's what I mean by testimony. Some of the most powerful things that I've seen happen haven't been when I'm talking, but when I'm listening to what other people in the room and the right people in the room are saying to each other. And so if you really want to build a resilient global system, many thousands of experiments in groundwater experiments have been run all over the world over the last hundreds, thousands of years. It's very hard to understand. We're all experts in one area or a few areas. So it's very, very hard to capture that. And so the challenge is how we use our convening power, our knowledge, to bring those groups together in a way that they can talk frankly and learn from each other. So to me, that's one of the baselines that we need to get to. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Nick. That was great. We are ahead of schedule, so here's how I'd like to manage this opportunity. I'd like to give us all 2 minutes to reflect on the presentations that we just had. That will give us time to shift our chairs to the front of the room for the panel discussion and invite Sumya to join us up front. But with that 2 minutes that you have, I'll share what I'm thinking about just to stir the pot and be provocative and help stir the conversation. Really interesting to think about kind of the producer at the core, but then these external influences. And acknowledging that we have limited time and money, right? There's an urgency to move forward and build trust as efficiently as possible. How do we do that? What are the next steps? Do we work with the farmers? Do we work with corporate ag? Where do we invest the time and the resources, the energy that we have and can contribute to moving beyond the discussion in this room? So I'll put the timer on. We have 2 minutes, and we'll move the chairs up front. Everyone, in the spirit of knowing that we all sit too much, please stand up and stretch your legs. You all have about 30 seconds. Do you see Sumya? I've lost Sumya. Oh, here she is. Are you ready if I pass the ball to you first, just for some general reactions to the discussion so far? All right. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you stretched, got some coffee, ready for some good conversation. Really pleased to open the dialogue and start off with another guest to our panel, Sumya Balasubramaya. Will join us, and we'll pass the ball to her first to share some general thoughts and reactions to the discussion so far and over the past few days.
Thanks for that. Oh, I hope this is working. I think it is. Yeah, right. I think I'm one of those who did change a lot. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm one of those who did change a lot. Anyway, it's nice. I mean, you know, put a fresh face on things, a fresh perspective. But anyway, thanks for being here, and it's lovely to be part of this conversation. My work and my interest has largely been in low and middle income countries in Asia and Africa. So it's so I think I would like to just share a few thoughts, you know, to put this conversation in a slightly larger perspective. And again, there is a lot of heterogeneity when we talk about low and middle income countries. They're not all the same, so it really does depend upon where you are and what state you know, of affairs are, and where the goals and where the priorities of these countries lie. So starting sort of with countries in sub-Saharan Africa particularly, we've heard a lot over the last few days from our colleagues who are talking about you know, rising food prices, falling per capita availability of food in the continent. How do we, you know, more imports that are putting you know, strain and stresses on government budgets, that compromises nutrition, food security outcomes, extreme poverty against a backdrop of climate change. The question really is, how do you quote unquote kickstart agriculture out there? And is it even possible to do that in a way that's not resource intensive? I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I think what's helpful to think about, at least for me, what I find useful is to think about when we look at the expansion of irrigated agriculture in other countries in Asia, where there is a longer history of it, what are the things that might have been done differently so that you might be at a different state of affairs today in those countries? Because it's very hard to retrofit things. I think that's part of what we're realizing. And so one of the things that strikes me, at least from the conversations that our colleagues are sharing and from the work that we're doing, and this is by no means me, there's a huge body of experts that are thinking about this, is it possible to develop or expand irrigated agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, where the emphasis does seem to be on groundwater more than surface water? Is it possible to do that using, you know, better hydrology, using better training, developing better extension services that might do this in a more guided manner thinking about aquifers, geology, developing these in areas where recharge is better, where it is sustainable. And then in general, thinking about larger macroeconomic processes where people can draw livelihoods from off-farm occupations. But that's a very big question, and it's not something that just the agricultural sector itself can or will necessarily sort of be able to solve. In that context, thinking about irrigation as a service, is it easier to have effective regulation when that is the model, while extending irrigation services to more people rather than trying to encourage everybody to purchase pumps? Might there be these kinds of benefits just in terms of better and easier ways to regulate use of resources when you go, when that's the model of irrigated expansion that we follow, and how might we think about that right now in order to sort of set that up in a way that manages some of these risks a bit better? I think that's something to think about. Then in the context of South Asia, I think it's sort of a very, very different state of affairs, right? Where there has been a green revolution, and the approach was very much to try and extend irrigated agriculture as aggressively, as quickly as possible. It was historically possible because the state really put a lot of time and effort into it, not just through offering fiscal subsidies on pumps and equipment, but actually through expertise and knowledge as well. I think that's the reason why, even though there may be droughts in South Asia, we don't necessarily see famine and hunger as much as we did before. Of course, that might be changing given the changing monsoons and how we manage those systems. But that certainly there's been this big achievement out there, and it has come at the cost of intensive use of resources. And so governments are sort of struggling with understanding, what do we do now? How do we retrofit, our systems so that we can try and moderate use of water in agriculture and try to reduce some of that use? And that's hard to do. It's hard to do because it's very hard introducing, pricing on water in a context where it's been a free-for-all and has been so for 60 years. And again, in a context where there is still a lot of poverty. I mean, Indian farmers, for example, they may not be destitute, but they're still poor. And so these are some political realities that make it very hard to implement these solutions. Thinking about putting caps on abstraction of groundwater monitoring it and actually doing it in a context where you have millions of smallholders is extremely difficult. It may not be the most practical way to go about doing this. Some folks have talked about, technologies such as drip irrigation, which certainly do improve, efficiency of water use, but that's given nothing else changes about the production system. So if farmers were not applying as much water as they could because, fuel is expensive, drip irrigation, even subsidized drip irrigation, just reduces the effective cost it reduces the energy use per unit land. And you may very well respond by either putting more land under irrigation or by changing, the crop type. So unless, drip irrigation is really implemented with some very strict caps on, are you allowed to change land use? Are you allowed to change what you cultivate? It may or may not result in those savings that we hope for. So there are some big challenges out there, and in this context, I think, at least what South Asia is looking at as well, if we can't put these incentives in, could we perhaps reward good behaviors instead? So can we just reward people and they abstract less water? So an example of that, for example, is giving farmers a quota of electricity and in exchange introducing metering in a context where energy and water use has never been metered historically. And then sort of incentivizing the farmer to say that if you don't use your entire cap of electricity, we'll purchase it back from you at some price. And does that work? Does that not work? And we've done some work to show that in Punjab, which is a very specific case of sort of where practically all land that could be irrigated is being irrigated. It's the state that benefited the most from the Green Revolution. This kind of pilot sort of cap on energy and with the option to buy back does produce some modest reductions in groundwater use. But scaling it up to include millions of farmers, the transaction costs that are involved in doing it, the monitoring costs that are involved in doing it are quite extensive. And at the end of the day, given that the aquifer that we're talking about is really depleting, do these modest reductions in groundwater abstraction, are they even sufficient? I mean, and that's a big question out there. So it's not entirely clear that even if it works, is it very well worth the effort? And that's a question that we do need to think about. The other big thing, of course, is solar irrigation. And a lot of this is being introduced in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in South Asia, simply because governments, particularly in the western part of the country, have subsidized electricity and practically provided it free of charge to farmers, so it bankrupts utilities. So the idea here being, can we make the switch by converting a variable cost subsidy in perpetuity to a one-time fixed cost subsidy that then the utility does not have to keep on subsidizing? But as you can imagine, once you have a solar pump, the cost of pumping is pretty much zero. So unless you really think about how do we make sure that people don't end up pumping more water, this could have challenges of different types. And so one of the things that's been talked about is, can you connect these pumps back to the grid? Can you incentivize farmers to, quote unquote, make money by not cultivating and instead selling electricity back to the grid? And the answer to that is also likely to vary and depend. It's going to depend upon how much of an incentive you offer, how much money do you offer the farmer to sell electricity back. If it's profitable for the farmer to maybe change crop type rather than sell electricity back and earn more, farmers would do that too. So I think some of these effects, we're very likely to see highly heterogeneous results in the subcontinent, and I think keeping an eye on that and understanding that is going to be extremely important, particularly if you're thinking of carbon credits, against solar emission programs, which seems to be an increasing conversation that we've even heard here in the last few days. So I think these are some of the the big challenges out there. And lastly, I think the one thing that I will say is, and this is something that China particularly, I think, is experimenting with in the range of middle-income countries, can you just get people out of agriculture? Because, and this is particularly the case in the North China Plain, where the groundwater is increasingly becoming very valuable for urban and peri-urban use. And so the Chinese have been piloting just paying farmers to not cultivate in the winter, so that that water does not get extracted. And I think some of the work that we've been doing with our colleagues from China suggests that yes, that obviously as farmers, if they're paid adequately enough and they're monitored, certainly that water doesn't get abstracted because no cultivation occurs, but it's expensive to do so. And you have to do this in perpetuity, so it's not entirely clear, how long can you keep on doing it unless off-farm activity also develops and the economy develops in a way that people just move out of agriculture and these payments are not necessary. And in the interim, one of the informal findings, of course, of these kinds of approaches has been that farmers may be at home and are being paid so that they are no worse off and maybe even a little better off in terms of what they might have earned had they cultivated. But that kind of being at home produces different kinds of social challenges, such as alcoholism, domestic violence. So there's been reports of these kinds of issues that are being tackled, and that opens up a whole new question on economic transformation in and of itself. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So here's how we're going to organize the remainder of this discussion. First, I'd like to invite the audience to share questions they have of the panelists before moving into, we have several planned questions for discussion where our panelists will respond, but then we'd also like your responses and thoughts to these questions as well. Catherine is going to help with the microphone for those in the audience. So the first step is just, again, that invitation.
First off, thank you very, very much. It's been such an informative event the last couple of days. I have a three-part question, or really three questions for Nick, Ellen, and Hannah. I have a friend who they buy $60 million a year worth of California carbon credits. Ellen, can they identify all the aquifers in California? Has it been mapped out, and can we find aquifers that have a contained ecosystem? And to Hannah, if those aquifers are identified, can go ahead and build the infrastructure to recharge those aquifers off the California Canal, and then on the surface be able to do a rewilding program for the Nature Conservancy? And last but not least, Nick, we need the math and science behind this to convince the California legislature and the political body that oversees this. We have to have your gray matter.
Okay, great. Yeah, I should reiterate, I'm an economist, not a hydrogeologist, and so my understanding is that there are mappings of the groundwater basins, at least in the context of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. There are a little bit of misnomers, and they're much smaller than what is they're subdivided for management purposes, but there is a lot of interconnectivity among them. And so I don't have a great answer. I think there is a lot of mapping that has been done, but I'm not the best person to speak to that. But for the purposes of this conversation, let's assume that it is mapped and known, and then go from there.
Well, unfortunately, even with that assumption, I also don't have the expertise to be able to answer your question. My expertise is not, I don't have much expertise in California water systems. The rewilding topic you bring up is really fascinating. I would maybe shift and say one thing that Nature Conservancy focuses on is thinking about how we can work on marginal and degraded lands. And so this is a lot of our work in the Cerrado region around the Amazon. And it's thinking about, all right, if we're trying to figure out how agriculture is going to expand and intensify, because that's probably going to happen whether or not we like it or not, right? How do we make sure we direct thought onto areas that are degraded pasture lands? So that it's not necessarily about like rewilding, it's about trying to leave the ecosystems intact as they are. From sort of a systems perspective, rewilding might have a lot of benefits, and so rewilding in this context, I assume you mean like taking that degraded land and sort of like quote unquote giving it back to nature. And that certainly can be an important tactic in different regions, but I would argue that protecting and avoiding conversion of intact ecosystems is much more important, and that's really, I think, where you'd find the Nature Conservancy focusing on worldwide is pretty consistently protecting ecosystems, but you might find folks at the local level who are working on rewilding. I just don't know. Tom Eisman is in the back of the room. He might have more context on California, so I would, direct you to him.
Well, I know just enough about carbon to be dangerous. So let me speak a little bit about California. The latest estimates, and Ellen, please jump in and correct, is that in order to reach sustainability, about 1 million acres, somewhere between 750,000 and 1 million acres will go idle. And so in order to reach that long-term water balance. And so I think what your point, one way of reflecting that is to say, we understand a lot of land is going to go out of productive agriculture into something else. Let's make sure we're targeting that land for multiple benefits, including, particularly ecosystem benefits, groundwater recharge benefits. People talk about putting solar on some of the land. One of the big issues is you can't just let the land go to dust or to bare ground, because then you'll really have an environmental catastrophe. So again, I think one way to reflect back your comment is let's make sure that we capture the full range of voices and all the stakeholders, so that land that is getting rewilded, that we get the most amount of benefits possible for it, because that will certainly be a political fight in terms of which land goes in and out of production. On the carbon credit side, there's many, many different flavors of carbon credits, both voluntary, right up to highly regulated. California has a regulated carbon market. So without knowing exactly what flavor of carbon credits your colleague is buying, it's really hard to say a lot. Agricultural carbon credits are very controversial right now, and it's an area that has, in a way, overwhelmed a lot of the larger conversation about soil health. And I'll say I personally have mixed feelings because on the one hand, it's brought a lot of money and a lot of attention into soil health issues. But on the other hand, it's focused everybody on this one thing that's actually quite hard to measure and subject to a lot of uncertainty and issues with permanence and so on. And it's monetized that in a way that perhaps we haven't thought through to the extent that we can. And so, Kathy, it looks like you're going to jump in too on that. And so the answer is, yeah, I mean, knowing what kinds of carbon credits and what those goals are, again, there is a path there and there is a path there for agriculture, but that science and the policy is still emerging.
Thank you very much.
I just want to point out how much I appreciate that question, right? Because it really brings to light or highlights how intertwined water management is with other ecosystem services, right? And we tend to silo these markets when I think most of us here understand that water is a fundamental driver of those ecosystem services. And so what keeps me up at night is, the carbon markets, the models, the accounting frameworks. We haven't really untangled those linkages in a way that we're reliably predicting or accounting for those benefits. And the potential to lose or break that trust because of that information gap is frightening.
So my question has to do, it's hard to get this adjusted right. The thing about in California, I was very interested in what you had to say. I don't live in California, but I did once upon a time. And when something ultimately goes to the state because either their plan is not sufficient or once they have the plan, they're not doing it correctly or whatever, and then it will relate to what's going to go idle, what you just talked about. Because at first I thought you meant idle acres is going to mean, well, the cities are taking on more. You're saying it's really going out of agriculture and producing something agriculturally. Maybe it'll produce solar energy, but so who and how have you set up the mechanism to enforce that? Because it would seem to me that regardless of whether it's a state government, a national in the United States, where I'm familiar with, but even internationally, what you were talking about with how something that's going to work here is not going to work there, because trust is not sufficient in the government, not at any. There is no farmer I know in the United States who trusts the government. And so that, but on the other hand, there's also things they want to have done. That's a lot to that.
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of the governance structure, from my understanding of these kind of local groundwater agencies under SGMA in California, there oftentimes are the previous surface water irrigation districts that have decided, okay, we'll take on, the groundwater here. And those districts are made up of farmers. And so I think that changes it in a little bit in that, the government in this case is made up of farmers. It's, this kind of. Oh, so when the state kind of comes in as the backstop because the plans have been deemed insufficient. Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of why it's a threatening thing that people want to avoid, and it's a fairly good incentive mechanism to figure it out on the local scale so that you avoid having somebody from the outside kind of come in. For how to yeah, I mean, it's there's a team at the State Water Resources Control Board that is prepared to do this, and so far they've said for 6 of the plans that they are going to be taking over control because they were deemed inadequate, but it's kind of a temporary thing, because if the local agency can take back kind of control. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of remains to be seen. This is just now happening. It was very recent that the state deemed those 6 plans insufficient enough that the state was going to come in and do it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the resources at the State Water Resources Control Board to take this over.
I'm going to speculate that ultimately every one of those plans will come back to local control. And so one of these mechanisms that we see is if growers don't like local government, they like the state government even less. And so where you end up with a lot of these things is that the local decision making uses the fear of things being kicked up to the state or the national level in order to then make change. So again, I would be very surprised in this case if all of those plans didn't go back to the groundwater sustainability agencies in the end. I just want to put a plug in your first point about the changes in irrigated acreage in California. Those things are already happening, and so in a sense, the effects of climate variability and climate change are already on us. We're just not very good at visualizing what that means for our irrigation system. So actually at the Institute, we have a new collaboration with the US Farmers and Ranchers in Action, which is a science-based advocacy group. They asked us to help them come up with a series of infographics that tell the story of water use in agriculture. And so we're actually right in the middle of that now. And in fact, among the first infographics is exactly this: what's the 20-year change in irrigated acreage across the US? And the trends you see are, irrigated acreage is already decreasing in the West, and the drivers are different in California or Colorado. In the East and in the Midwest, there's actually already quite a large increase in irrigated acreage. And again, the drivers there are drought, the mechanics of agricultural contracts and so on, but the changes are already on us. So a little plug there for things to watch from us, yeah.
Next question.
Hi, Nick. Sorry. So I guess the disclaimer here is that I'm new to the space of water. But if we step back, it seems like you talked about trust and how when you go with your models to the producers, they probably shouldn't take you up on them because they don't necessarily trust you. So it looks like all of this is working within the system. And if we have learned anything the last 5 to 7 years, is that the system perhaps is not the best. So there's social justice and racial justice issues and all of that. I would like for the panel to step back and see how all of these plug into those issues that we probably haven't thought about when we place those systems in the first place. Yep.
So social justice is a huge issue. So I guess there's 2 points. One is we have to know our place in the larger ecosystem of actors. And so academics have a role, as do nonprofit groups, as do the ag banks and the industry. So again, you have to come to a collective understanding. And I'm sharing that as academics, we often think that we know everything. And my experience at every point in my career has been, until I go out and ask people what their lived experience is, I don't actually know what even the right questions to ask are. The social justice issue is particularly important. It's important in California, where when you look at a lot of those farming communities, the social justice issues that groundwater depletion affects the migrant communities who rely on shallow groundwater wells for drinking. And so there is absolutely a social justice issue there that people are aware of. It's very, very hard to deal with because many of those communities are disenfranchised. I believe that TNC, among other groups, is working very much holistically to address those issues and build those bridges. I know there are other groups active in the Central Valley to do that. In the other context we work in, we hope there are similar things, but again, we have to be sensitive that none of us have all of the answers. We need to rely on the expertise and knowledge and experience of others. I guess I'll pass that to Anna if you want to.
Really important question. Thank you for answering it. A few things, and so the first is, respect for people and communities is one of the Nature Conservancy's core values, and it's infused in everything we do. When I think about the complexity framework that I proposed, I think something that's a really important factor when you think about sort of the on-the-ground users or communities is a term I like to call fate control. I did not make this up. This is from the public health literature. And it's the idea that communities, especially communities who are historically disenfranchised or marginalized, need both an abundance of options and the ability to choose amongst them and act on those options. And oftentimes we see marginalized communities, like one way to define them is that they have been, they're limited in their ability to make those choices and to have options. And not only is this important from a social justice perspective, but from the perspective of actually like fixing the system and getting the outcomes we want. What we need to do is we need to give the capacity, the resources, and the space to local communities for them to define what resilience means to them, what those fate pathways look to them. And typically what you're going to find is outcomes that improve resilience and well-being of not just those communities, but everyone else around them. And so I think it's really important when you're like trying to operationalize that concept on the ground to use something called human-centered design, which is provide the resources and the structure and the flexibility that's requested and no more, right? Like don't impose specific structures, don't try to over-engineer solutions when what you really want to do is give the capacity for local innovation and flexibility and fate control.
No, I think that's a great point. There's a lot of emerging, I mean, there is already literature out there, but there's also emerging work that's looking at how access to even productive resources in let's say, sub-Saharan Africa or countries there, or even in South Asia, is highly mediated by what one might call social identity, which could be elements of ethnicity, religion, race, gender, caste, in countries where that's important. And that is historically, so you're really talking about sort of, it's not a Markovian thing, you're here because there is history. And then how do you talk about breaking through that? And in a sense, that's really the crux of the problem, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about rationalizing resource use in a context where there's not just poverty, but also extreme inequality. And so how do you think about designing policies and programs that pay attention to that from the get-go? And I'm not sure, I mean, I think we all agree what the problem is. I think solving it is an entirely different matter. And part of it is, from a practical perspective, is what do you do when you talk about targeting? Very often targeting is often based on metrics of wealth and assets, which are somewhat correlated to social identity, but they're not the same. And so, how do you access public goods? Right? You might be privately, you might have had assets because of, say, remittances that came from abroad, etc., but your own ability in your own space to access public goods may not be as high because of that historical disadvantage and the status that you don't command that prevents you from getting to the table. So I think it's a great point. I don't have an answer for how you fix it, but I think it's certainly the case that I think it needs to probably get a bit more attention in the dialogue that we have. Maybe we need to pay more attention, more explicit attention to distribution than we probably do in our conversations. Yeah.
So your question gives an opportunity to reflect on one of the panel questions. And just to start, to reflect on collaborative learning and thinking, and what does that mean? And I'll share an experience, or two, actually, realizations. So one was the opportunity to attend a Tribal Nations Sustainability Conference. And I was struck by their knowledge in terms of understanding that we need to manage our ag systems in the context of the river system, that every field is different and every field has a tie or connection to the river system and needs to be managed accordingly, depending on the seasonal weather patterns, right? So what struck me about that was clear evidence that we need to elevate and recognize the technical expertise that all of us can bring to the table, and that minority communities are really important. And then the second kind of realization was looking at a tribal nations map, right, and seeing that the tribal nations were built around rivers, not jurisdictional boundaries. So knowing that we really need to elevate our collaborative learning, and that collaborative learning is critical to building trust. And then thinking about the different stakeholders, the farmers, the landowners, ultimately making the decision to put these practices on the ground. Where do we begin, or your thoughts about creating awareness, willingness, and engaging those communities or in our different ag regions?
So the question was, how do we start with collaborative learning?
Reflecting back on the collaborative learning, thinking about the question of engaging the diversity of partners on the ground. How does that influence your thinking about next steps, next actions, how we move forward from this forum?
So how does collaborative, I'm just repeating it for the folks online. So how does collaborative learning sort of inform how we move forward and advance in this space, is one way to say it. I mean, I would just probably reiterate my comments and those of the panelists, which is that if you don't move forward with diverse voices in the room, you're just leaving opportunities on the table. To me, I might take it a little bit different direction, and I would say that I've worked with a lot of indigenous communities in interior Alaska, and an overly formal approach and overly Western approach doesn't always elicit that collaborative learning, right? And so I think the first step is to actually take a step back and ask, how can we create conditions where we are playful and open and flexible and creative? I think that creativity and the playfulness is really important. That's where a lot of innovation can come from, and that's a way for us to sort of talk within our own sort of expertise and also across expertise. So sometimes I worry a little bit that the conversations are maybe too formal, maybe too rigid, maybe overly directed towards like these global outcomes, whereas I think a lot of the creativity you can get from just like being more playful and open.
Should I have any things that come up?
Kathy, one more question. Oh, unless I put something.
All right, thank you. My question goes to Sumia. So in addition to rewarding good behavior and subsidies on this expensive equipment that like drip irrigation and solar that you mentioned, like are we thinking about whether these are the best solutions, especially for like people for smallholder in Africa and Asia? You mentioned that the cost of irrigation is zero once, like for example, farmers get the solar panels, but aren't we also like encouraging like water overuse in these areas? Because again, if you think about the context in which smallholder irrigate using solar panels, it's when, like it's at the peak hours, and also like that is when the Eva transfer, yeah, is also like high. ET is high, so that can encourage like overuse of water. But also, are these the best solutions? Since like I'm speaking about like Africa, where like security is. Like there is insecurity for this equipment, so there is that like that context that comes in of like transporting this equipment in and out of the field when they're supposed to be in the field, like for however many hours they have to be in the field, and this also like damages this like equipments, especially the panels for the case of solar panels. So are these like the best like solutions that we are providing? In the context of smallholders, again, in Africa and Asia?
I think it depends on, the answer depends on the problem you're trying to solve. I think there are lots of questions and the evidence still seems to be emerging. I think the jury's still out on a lot of this stuff. I think in certain contexts, providing solar irrigation can be, particularly in South Asia, can be an important a strategy to support smallholder incomes and increase intensification in a manner where the government does not have to keep subsidizing something in perpetuity. But everything, there are trade-offs. Actions have reactions, right? That's what the laws of physics tell us. And I think in that sense, it's no different here. And the question becomes, what are the gains and what are the risks and what are the consequences? Can we manage those consequences? Or do we know that they're not manageable, but we still think that we need to get this done? And I think it's very hard to give a blanket answer to that. I think the point that I hope I'm trying to communicate is that it helps to think these things through. And to be able to say, this is what it gets us, this is what it doesn't get us, and that might allow us to adaptively manage things as we go along, as opposed to sort of maybe assuming that it gets everything done when the evidence actually suggests that it's probably not going to be the case. So I think that's really the spirit in which it's not. I'm sort of ambiguous about it. I'm pretty, about all of this stuff. It's just about what are you trying to get done? Does it fit the purpose? And in trying to solve that problem, even if you did solve it, something else would have likely happened, and it helps to pay attention to that, which is sort of a very practical cop-out, I know, but I'm not sure how else you go about doing this.
Come to the end of our panel. Very grateful for all the great input and discussion. Let me share our next steps. Want to start by thanking Peter, Christopher, and Francis, and all the staff at the Daughtery Water for Food Institute for a great conference that's really fed our discussion today. And so what we intend to do from here is to reflect on these discussions and come up with a first draft list of ideas, if you will, to share at World Water Week in Stockholm, and to engage even a broader audience in thinking about what are the next steps, the next actions that we can actually take beyond these great conversations here. So with that, a warm thank you to our panelists and to all of you for helping to feed the conversation.